Most career content focuses on how to get a job. Very little of it covers what happens when things go wrong after you get one. Today we're talking about something almost nobody discusses directly, being the bad hire. What it actually means, how it happens, and what to do differently. This isn't about failure. It's about understanding a dynamic that most people experience at least once, but rarely get a clear framework for. First, we need to separate two things that people constantly confuse: a performance problem and a fit problem. A performance problem means you cannot do the work. Missing skills, insufficient output, consistent errors. That's a real thing. A fit problem is different. You can do the work, but the way you do it, the speed you operate at, the environment you need to succeed, doesn't match the specific context you landed in. Most people who get let go have a fit problem, not a performance problem. That distinction matters a lot for what you do next. Why do companies hire wrong in the first place? A few reasons, and most of them are systemic. Hiring managers are under pressure to fill roles fast. They're interviewing for the version of the role that exists today, not the version it will evolve into in 6 months. The interview process is also a different context from the job. You're both performing. They're selling the company. You're selling yourself. The conditions that surface actual fit problems rarely come up in 45-minute conversations. And here's the uncomfortable part. Companies often don't know exactly what they need until they see someone who doesn't quite fit it. Culture fit gets a lot of criticism, usually deserved. It's been used as cover for bias. But the underlying thing it's trying to describe is real. What culture fit actually measures is operating style. Not personality, operating style. The defaults you bring to how you work. How fast do you communicate? Do you send a message and wait? Or do you move and report back? How much ambiguity can you hold before needing clarity? Do you ask for permission or proceed and inform? None of those is right or wrong universally. But some companies operate on very different defaults than others. And when yours don't match, it creates friction that's hard to name, but easy to feel. The 90-day clock is something almost no one tells new hires about explicitly. Managers form impressions quickly. Not always consciously, but quickly. In the first 4 to 6 weeks, they're observing how you communicate, how you handle your first ambiguous situation, whether you ask the right questions, whether your instincts seem calibrated. By day 90, most managers have a reasonably settled view. They may not have communicated it. They may still be hoping it shifts. But the preliminary conclusion is usually there. The implication: your first 90 days are not a warm-up. They're when the lasting impression is made. There's often a gap between the role you were hired for and the role you actually started. This isn't deceptive. It's just the nature of how companies work. Priorities shift. A reorganization happens. The manager who hired you leaves, and their replacement has different priorities. The project you were brought in for gets deprioritized. What you were hired to do and what the company actually needs you to do end up being different things. And if your skills and instincts were calibrated for the original brief, you're now misaligned through no fault of your own. This doesn't make it not your problem, but understanding it helps you respond to it correctly. When priorities shift after you start, there's a window where you can either get ahead of it or fall behind it. Getting ahead means noticing the shift, naming it in a conversation with your manager, and actively repositioning. The project I was brought in for seems to have changed scope. What would be most useful for me to focus on now? Falling behind means not noticing or noticing but not acting, and allowing a growing misalignment to quietly accumulate. Most people fall behind, not because they're passive, but because the signals are subtle and the stakes feel high. Raising the question can feel like admitting failure. It isn't. One of the clearest signs that a manager has already decided something about you is that feedback stops. This sounds counterintuitive. You'd expect more feedback if there's a concern. But what usually happens is the opposite. The manager mentally moves to a different phase, figuring out next steps, and stops investing in the correction conversation. When feedback gets vague or sparse, or starts arriving through formal processes rather than direct conversation, that's information. Not panic-inducing, but worth noticing. The feedback vacuum means something has been decided. Your job at that point is to figure out what it is. 3 things tend to happen before anyone formally tells you there's a problem. Feedback gets vague. Specific development-oriented comments become general, then occasional, then stop. You stop getting included in planning conversations. The early discussions about where things are heading, you used to be in those. Then you weren't. Your manager stops advocating for you upward. You don't see this directly, but you can infer it from whether your work gets referenced in meetings, whether you're mentioned when relevant decisions come up. None of these guarantees you're about to be let go, but they're signals worth taking seriously. There's a self-assessment question almost nobody asks before accepting a job. What am I actually assuming about this role that I haven't verified? The assumptions are usually about the operating environment, how autonomous it is, how collaborative, whether the pace is something you'll find energizing or draining, what success actually looks like in the first year. You ask about salary and start date. You don't always ask about what your manager's communication style is, or how much direct feedback you'll get, or what the biggest internal challenge of the role is. Those questions feel risky to ask. They're exactly what you need to know. Reading a role correctly in the interview stage is a learnable skill, but most people aren't taught it. The job description tells you what the company thinks they need. The interview tells you a bit more. But what you're really trying to determine is, does this specific role, with this specific team, in this specific moment of the company's development, fit the way I actually work? A few things to look for. How do the interviewers describe the last person in this role? What happened to them? How do they talk about what's not working currently? Those answers reveal a lot about operating expectations that won't appear in the job description. There are specific questions you can ask in interviews that reveal operating style before you commit. Ask how decisions typically get made on the team. Ask what the communication norms are, how quickly people are expected to respond, what channels get used for what. Ask what someone did in their first 3 months that made a strong impression. Ask about the biggest friction in the team right now. Ask what they wish they'd told the last person in this role. Those questions get you past the pitch and into the actual environment. The answers aren't always complete, but they're more honest than anything in the job description. How you handle the first 90 days is different when you understand the clock is running. The most important thing you can do in the first 30 days isn't to deliver output. It's to understand the environment. Who has influence? How does information actually move? What's the real priority versus the stated priority? Visible quick wins help, but they only help if you're solving the right problem. A quick win on the wrong thing can actually signal misalignment. You shipped something impressive that nobody needed. Invest the first 30 days in understanding before optimizing. What do you do when you feel the gap opening mid-roll? You name it, directly and early. I want to make sure I'm focused on the right things. My read on the priorities is X. Is that aligned with what you're seeing? This is uncomfortable to do because it feels like admitting you're behind. The people who do it tend to stay in roles. The people who don't tend to be let go and then wish they'd said something earlier. Clarity is recoverable. Prolonged misalignment is harder to come back from. If you sense something is wrong and it's not being raised formally, you can raise it yourself. This takes a specific kind of directness. I want to check in on how things are going from your perspective. I want to make sure I understand if there are things I should be doing differently. That question gives your manager an opening. Some will use it honestly. Others won't. But it shifts the dynamic. You're no longer waiting, you're engaging. It also creates a record. If the situation does go formal later, you've already demonstrated you were actively trying to course correct. What references actually say about you is something most people have very little visibility into. References tend not to lie outright, but they shade things. The absence of enthusiasm in a reference carries information. A reference who says, yes, she was diligent and reliable, is saying something different from one who says she rebuilt the onboarding process from scratch in her first quarter. What you can control. Choose references who have specific things to say about specific outcomes you drove. She was a pleasure to work with is almost useless. She shipped X by doing Y, and here's the result is a reference. Coach your references. Tell them what role you're applying for and what the most relevant things for them to mention are. The shift from thinking, I failed, to understanding, I was mismatched, is not just emotional, it's practical. If you think you failed, the lesson is to try harder next time. Work longer hours. Be more impressive in interviews. Look more committed. If you understand it was a fit problem, the lesson is different. Know yourself more accurately. Read environments more carefully. Ask better questions before you commit. One lesson is about output. The other is about judgment. The fit problem lesson is the one that actually prevents it from happening again. Using what you've learned to pick the next role more accurately is the practical output of this whole process. You now know something specific about the operating environments where you don't thrive. You know what questions you should have asked. You know what early signals to watch for. The next interview isn't just about impressing them. It's about finding out if this specific role, in this specific team, at this specific company, is an environment where you'll actually be able to do your best work. You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. That's not arrogance, it's accuracy. Most people repeat the pattern across multiple roles because they draw the wrong conclusion from each one. They take the role because it sounds impressive, or it was the best offer they had, or they needed the money. The operating environment wasn't a primary consideration. They get into it and feel the friction. They work harder. They don't raise it. They get let go or leave before it gets to that. Then they do roughly the same thing in the next role. The pattern breaks when you start treating fit as the primary selection criterion, not an afterthought. What we covered today: the difference between a performance problem and a fit problem, why companies hire wrong, what culture fit actually measures, the 90-day clock, how to read a role before you commit, what to do when the gap opens, and how to pick the next role differently. The main takeaway is this: being the bad hire is usually not about being bad at your job. It's about a mismatch between how you work and what that specific role needed. Understanding that doesn't undo what happened. It does change what you do next. Full article at realsyllabus.com.